Okay, calm down.
Craig Mokhiber is an excellent source of information and analysis. As someone who is a human rights lawyer and was a UN official, he obviously has a very firm grasp on international law and human rights and the way that things like this violate that. So we're going to bring on back to the show Craig Mokhiber. Hi, Craig. How are you?
Hi, Katie. I'm okay. Thank you.
I wanted to start out by asking you to respond to what just happened.
And I think our thoughts are all with the people in Lebanon. I've been seeing messages from people who are just, as Rania was pointing out, are living in terror. Everybody's afraid of their telephones. And, it's interesting. I heard her talking about some of these trolls online. I've gotten a few of those as well, all of them implying that I should be careful in using my telephone, kind of your next sort of thing. And the celebrations coming from that wing of society, quite disturbing as well. This was a massive terrorist attack on the Lebanese people and the country of Lebanon. Thousands of people, as Rania pointed out, have been hurt. And the Lebanese people are terrorized by it. And I said that's the first thing is that any place that something like this happened, it would be a historic event because of the scope and the nature of the attack. The degree to which the Western media tries to sanitize this one, I think is going to be very disturbing. I'm not sure they're going to get away with it. I think secondly, it also opens up a very dangerous new front on global terrorism, putting us all at risk. Once again, Israel has found a way to threaten the safety of all of us, because this is another tactic of terrorism that won't stop with Israel doing it to Lebanon. In this case, Israel will likely do it in other places, and others will mimic this approach as well. And so once again, Israel has made us all less safe. It's also a major escalation, possibly could provoke a wider war. We've all been afraid that ultimately that Israel's provocations in Lebanon and elsewhere could spread more broadly in the region. This is something that Hezbollah will have to respond to, predictably. And we don't know what the next step is going to be, or whether this was something preemptive done by Israel in order to prepare its own subsequent attacks. And then the other point that I was making as an international lawyer is that this was a grave breach of international humanitarian law and a gross violation of human rights law. In human rights law, obviously, extrajudicial executions are prohibited. Targeting civilians is prohibited in IHL, and we know not all Hezbollah.
IHL is international human rights
international
law, right?
Humanitarian law.
Humanitarian law, okay.
Yes, some of these were targeting civilians. Not all Hezbollah personnel are combatants. They are a political party. They're in the government. They run services and so on. And so targeting those individuals is a violation of international humanitarian law just on its face. Also note that the ambassador of Iran was wounded in one of these attacks, with all of the implications that come with that. But at the very least, the ambassador of Iran is very clearly a civilian, whatever his relationship to Hezbollah.
Right.
And then international humanitarian law also prohibits indiscriminate attacks, because you have to prevent the risk to others who are nearby. And here you've got people driving in cars when the explosion goes off, standing in crowds, shopping and so on, potentially on an airplane, you don't know, or at a gas station or something. So these are indiscriminate attacks by their very nature. And then the other thing that I haven't heard others talk about is that booby traps are generally prohibited in international humanitarian law because of the risk that they pose to civilians.
Right.
So in international humanitarian law, when they talk about booby traps, the ones that are prohibited are, and I'm quoting, things that are designed to look like harmless portable objects, something you can carry around with you, right? Clearly pagers and phones and those sort of things would count, or something that is disguised as something that would be attractive to civilians. So no matter how you look at that, these kinds of booby traps are prohibited by international humanitarian law. And even booby traps that didn't meet those, didn't have those qualities, they're still subject to the general rules on the conduct of hostility. So So let's say that some of these things were provided to combatants amongst the Hezbollah personnel, and even if they didn't meet those, which they do, these were pagers. They were designed to look like harmless portable civilian objects, right? But even if they weren't, you see here a violation of the principle of distinction. You have to be able to make sure that your attacks will affect combatants and not civilians who are nearby. Proportionality, the principle of precaution. These were just blind attacks. These were not attacks that took place when somebody was on the battlefield or was segregated or whatever. There was no precaution to avoid or minimize incidental loss of civilian life or injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects. All of those principles were violated by this massive terrorist attack that took place on Lebanon today. And I have said it will have to be followed by accountability. And interestingly, we've had decades of the entire Western world talking about the importance of international cooperation to respond to terrorist attacks. Let's see how much international cooperation follows this massive terrorist attack from the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and others in the West. I won't be holding my breath.
You said there has to be accountability, but will there be accountability? And what is the effect of the lack of accountability? I mean, when the West does nothing about this, which I assume they won't, how does this embolden Israel? And what do you think it would look like, a world in which Israel were held to account? How much less terrorism and violence would we see?
The central principle of international human rights and international humanitarian law is the idea that impunity cannot be allowed to stand because it encourages further violations.
Right.
That, if a state or a non-state actor can get away with something without being held accountable under the law, they're more likely to do it again. And the problem with Israel is it's had 76 years of impunity because it's had a brick wall of impunity built around it by the United States, the United Kingdom, some other Western powers that prevent it from being held to account. Just this week, again, we see threats against the International Criminal Court, which is in principle preparing to issue arrest warrants for the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense of Israel for crimes against humanity. We've seen attacks from Western governments against the International Court of Justice for its work and findings, and the genocide trial against Israel. You've seen, allegations, or not allegations, but revelations of Western intelligence agencies from the United States, from Israel, and elsewhere harassing, threatening, persecuting judicial personnel in the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. We've seen delays in justice in those cases, probably attributable to that kind of intimidation. So the US, the UK, Germany, and some others in the West work very hard to ensure Israeli impunity. Not only is that likely to lead to more violations, not only has that led to a chain of continuous violations of international law by Israel over a period of decades, and not only is it likely to lead to more of these kinds of violations perpetrated by Israel, but it's also likely to lead to the use of these kinds of tactics by others. Because if it's okay for Israel to do it, it's okay for others to do it. If it's not a crime when Israel does it, it's not a crime when ISIS does it, for example. And so these kinds of things, if there isn't accountability, make us all less safe. I don't expect accountability to come from any Western countries or any Western-controlled institutions, which means the Security Council will be unable to act because of the U.S. veto, undoubtedly. But let's hope that judicial institutions will be in a position, or perhaps more majoritarian institutions like the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, to follow up on all of this. There's, at the same time, Katie, there is a resolution which is being negotiated in the General Assembly as a follow-up to the most recent opinion of the International Court of Justice that found that Israel's occupation of the entire West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem is entirely unlawful, that they have to leave, dismantle, and that all states have to cut off their trade, diplomatic, and economic relations with Israel to the extent that they relate to the occupied territories. And in the General Assembly right now, they're negotiating a resolution that will probably be adopted on Wednesday or so, tomorrow, maybe later. And part of what is in the current draft is the idea of establishing accountability mechanisms to make sure that Israel doesn't get away with the crimes that it's been perpetrating with impunity. You could see something similar for these kinds of actions. So you will remember from our previous conversations, when the Security Council is blocked by the US veto, then the General Assembly can act under Uniting for Peace, emergency special session, or in a regular session to adopt measures to try to hold Israel accountable. But I think people all around the world need to make their voices heard, that this very dangerous rogue state, which just keeps upping the ante, including, as relates to terror directed against the Palestinian indigenous people, to its neighbors, and, through its proxies to all of us who dare to speak out. It's really important that everyone make their voice heard and say enough is enough. This can't continue.